Hello, everyone. Welcome. I apologize for the late sending out of the link. That was an oversight on our part. We're just going to give a couple extra minutes for folks to find that link in their inboxes, and then we'll get started here in just a couple minutes. While we're waiting, if you're new here with us, if you've never been to one of our webinars before, introduce yourself in the chat. You might find other people who do similar work to what you do. If you're here for work purposes or if you're here for personal enrichment, we enjoy finding out why people are here. So yeah, feel free to introduce yourself. Let us know where you're from. Like I said, we're going to give just a couple extra minutes since we were late sending out that link. Florida. How's the weather in Florida? Raining. It's always raining in Florida, right? Cool. So welcome to those who are just coming in from the waiting room. We're giving just a couple extra minutes since we were a little tardy sending out the link at the last second. So we're just going to give people a couple extra minutes to find the link in their inboxes and join us, and then we'll get started here momentarily. In the meantime, enjoy the fish. Hi, Zita, New Zealand. Welcome. Nice to have you. Well, we're glad you found us. All right, so let's see. And while we're waiting for everyone to finish getting on, we do usually ask that everyone stay muted during the presentation, just for audio clarity, but feel free to put any questions in the chat. And we might have a small enough group tonight if you have a question and you really need to get an answer, because we know how that is when you're listening to something and you have a question. Sometimes your brain can't focus on what you're hearing because you're so distracted by your own question. So feel free, like I said, put it in the chat, use the little raise hand feature. I'll interrupt Michael and say, hey, we got somebody with a question. So feel free to do that. There's not so many people here tonight that we can't do that. And like I said, yeah, introduce yourself in the chat, especially if this is your first time with us. So welcome to those coming in from the waiting room right now. And we also have a little survey that we usually will put in the chat. So if you have any, bigger, more in-depth questions, you can feel free to put those in that survey. And then we always try to go through the surveys as quick as we can after the presentations to find out what people have on their minds. Australia, excellent, glad to have you. All right, so I'm thinking we're probably getting pretty close. We'll be able to let people in if they come in the next few minutes. So what we'll do, we'll probably jump onto the next slide and I'll just give y'all a little background on what we do. So over the last 14 years, the Relationship Foundation has developed a curriculum that has been used by teachers in schools. It was actually, it's a result of a lot of collaboration between teachers, social workers, counselors, and much of what you'll see here tonight, our curriculum shows how to put into practice in a classroom. And then we also have sort of a guidebook version that can be used in other organizations. It's been used in places from counselors who work with inmates in prisons, organizations that work with helping trafficked women, organizations that are advocates for children who are in foster care, you name it, especially if you're even have a little bit of familiarity with trauma work, you know how widespread it is and what the applications are. So that is part of what we do, is the curriculum for schools, the guidebook. We have our book, which you can get for free on our website. Of course, we'd love to get donations because we are a nonprofit. So that is how we operate. But that is the basis of what you hear here tonight. Is just what we're doing here is just a little taste of our larger program that we have available, like we said, for schools, organizations, really anyone. And so actually how we've gotten to where we are right now is last March, April, when all the schools shut down, we actually continued giving our school workshops for free of charge for quite a few of the New York City schools as their budgets froze. And then we started implementing our webinar series as a way to reach more people outside of the school system, which has been really great. We've met so many amazing people in the last year from all over the world, more people than we ever imagined we would have met. So, and then on the screen here, you can see some of the ways you can sort of stay connected with us, be involved in this trauma responsive movement. We're on Patreon, we're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, all of those. For people that join our Patreon, we give the access to our webinars where you don't have to register on Eventbrite ahead of time. And then we try to give other little goodies and freebies and stuff throughout the month. We have t-shirts on Bonfire. Like we said, you can download our book, which you can see on the lower left there, but that's for free on our website. And like we said, we'll be putting a chat in the survey that'll have some of these links and different things. So you can come check out our website later if you haven't already. So we will be doing that. And so I think I covered most of the bases of just the background that we like to give everyone before we start. And again, if you have any questions for anyone who's just coming in, if anything pops into your mind, use the chat, use the little raise hand feature. I'll interrupt Michael if he doesn't see your hand, and because we have a fairly small group tonight. So, and we always welcome everyone to stay afterwards for just, open discussion and just asking questions. So I think that's it. I'll turn it over to Michael.
Okay, good evening, everybody, or good afternoon in Australia and New Zealand. And I think England, it's getting toward dream time. So thank you, everybody, for joining in. And again, if you would put in the chat where you're from, what your organization is that you're involved in, and specifically where you are coming from, because we always get a sort of, I don't know, like we get a kick out of seeing where everybody's from. Okay, so as described in the Eventbrite, we'll be reviewing a groundbreaking medical study done in San Diego in the mid-90s. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE study. And the ACE is our way of looking at childhood trauma and how it affects really the majority of our population. Now, we mentioned the application of this study in terms of how it affects school children, but it also affects adults and families in both their personal and work relationships. Now, we're going to look at the neuroscience of trauma, how it affects our brain chemistry, and how we can expand our perspective in a way that leads to more compassion and self-awareness. In community organizations, schools, and the medical profession, there's what's known as the trauma responsive approach, and it is spreading rapidly. We'll go into that as the evening goes on. Now, the past year has been traumatic, especially for school-aged children, and it's not like they're going to come back to school and pick up where they left off. And the way things stand today, we don't know who's going to be in school and who's not. So there's still a lot of fear that lies ahead, especially for children. And the social distancing aspect of classrooms alone can, in and of itself, be traumatizing. Now, this is because it suggests that something is still uncertain, and children thrive on predictability at school and at home. So by predictability, when they come into the classroom, if they're used to seeing certain things that are on the bulletin boards and certain things that are routine in the class, that actually is something that children look forward to because it's a known factor. And just the other day, a parent told me about a child who literally cried every day during the shutdown. So there's a lot to consider as schools might be opening. And there are children who also were essentially trapped at home in unsafe environments. These eliminated their ability to literally escape to school. And if you add to this food insecurity and the proliferation of abuse, neglect, and family turmoil, children need greater safety and support than ever before. So this takes into account the difficulties children experience both at home and in school that may affect not only their ability to learn, but their health and well-being in their adult years. So here's some background on the trauma-informed movement and how it began. In the mid-90s, Dr. Vincent Felitti was the medical director of a weight loss clinic in San Diego. He became concerned when many of his patients lost a lot of weight and then quickly gained it back. He decided to reach out and ask some questions of the people who left to get a better understanding of the people who volunteered to speak with him. The first person that he met, he asked them how much they weighed when they were in first grade. Then he asked how much they weighed when they graduated high school. Next, he meant to say, how old were you when you first had sex? Assuming it was as an adult. But instead, he said, how much did you weigh by mistake when you first had sex? The first person he spoke to was a woman, and she said 40 pounds, that her father had raped her when she was very young. As he continued the interviews, he discovered that sexual abuse was quite prevalent. And he was really shocked as there was very little public awareness of such behavior back in the mid-90s. And he decided to begin an investigation into childhood abuse, which began a year-long investigation with over 17,000 people who volunteered to answer questions about their childhood maltreatment. This led to the start of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which we'll go into in detail. It's also known as the ACE study. So to give you an idea of some of what Dr. Felitti discovered, you can Google, there's a short tribute. It says tribute to Dr. Felitti, and we'll put that in a chat toward the end of the workshop. An example of trauma that led to severe health crisis was shared by Dr. Felitti in that video. And one of the things that he talked about was a young man who had wanted to play baseball all of his life, but his arm broke when he was 12 years old. And this was somebody that Dr. Felitti knew through relatives. And many, many years later, after this 12-year-old boy had grown up, he had become alcoholic and obese, and he died at the age of 40. Well, Dr. Felitti found out it was his mother that broke his arm in a fit of rage. So we really have to think about what happens in a child's early life to understand some of what goes on later in adult life. And one of the things that he also mentioned is that animals can't survive if their mother abandons them. To many of us, we've experienced that sense of being abandoned in childhood. And for me personally, due to extreme neglect, I somewhat died inside at a very early age. Now we're going to share a bit about the science of the brain and the body and how trauma affects them and how the healing process can begin. And recent studies now show that trauma can be seen as an explanation for why children sometimes act out in negative ways. As a result, to some extent, teachers especially are now looking at the possible root causes. For families, understanding trauma can be a path to repair. This is important because now people are starting to see disruptive, even illegal behavior as a result of trauma rather than a character defect. Criminals are made at home. This thought allows us to better understand why the result of abuse can lead to law-breaking behavior. So as a result of Dr. Felitti's work, his study has become well known throughout the country and around the world. It's called, as I mentioned, the ACE study. The study was conducted in the mid-90s in San Diego at a health clinic, and the study revealed that 2/3 of the volunteers had at least one ACE, and 90% had two or more. There was also an ACE study conducted in Philadelphia where there's a very high rate of poverty, and 90% of the participants had at least one ACE. And we're going to go into why poverty alone is traumatic. Now, next is the adverse childhood experiences list. There are 10 ACEs, 3 abuse, 2 neglect, and 5 family turmoil. Let's take a few seconds to read over these different ACEs. There'll also be a link in the chat to this list. So you see under abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual. Neglect covers emotional neglect and physical neglect. And in many ways, physical neglect is not only not being held and not touched and receiving the kind of embrace that children need, but it's also not enough food, not enough clean clothes. And then there's the 5 family turmoil. So I have 3 ACEs that I know of. And at first, these personal ghosts being awakened was very challenging for me. And I had a lot of resistance to revisiting my own past. But when I became aware of my ACEs, it helped me put into perspective how I had been held back in my life goals and been unable to maintain healthy and thriving relationships. Then I began to have more clarity about my behavior as I studied the ACEs study, and this really began to change for the better. Now, with the absence of safety, stability, and care, the negative effects of trauma build up and worsen over time. Now, we're going to watch a video in a moment where you can see that the negative effects of trauma can lead to the kind of situation where people get involved in crime and wind up being incarcerated. So let's play that video. We should be able to bring that up now.
It's time now, everyone. We're gonna do the compassion trauma circle. Is everyone ready to face their past with compassion? Is that a yes? Yeah! While you were growing up, during your first 18 years of life, if a parent or other adult in the household often or very often would swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, step inside the circle. If a parent or other adult in the household often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or threw something at you, step inside the circle. If a parent or other adult in the household often or very often ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured, step inside the circle. If you often felt that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, step inside the circle. If your family lived in extreme poverty, step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. Step inside the circle.
There is no shame. There is no shame. There is no shame.
I'm so good. Good to see you. How are you? Amen. Noel, good to see you, honey. Welcome. I was abused as a young girl. I was beaten by my mother. I was verbally abused by my mother. I was sexually abused by another man. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was a rageaholic. I've driven drunk. I've sold drugs. I was a juvenile delinquent. Probably my story is similar to most of your stories in here. I'm white and I'm female and nothing happened to me. So, I got a get out of jail free card. And so I'm here now because I see myself in every one of you.
I'm a traumatized child, raised by a traumatized child. My mother was traumatized as well as her parents.
Like he said, we wasn't born in the world of being evil people. My mother didn't want me. She hid her pregnancy. She tried to flush me down the toilet. But as I learned about these things, I always asked myself what was wrong with me.
When I come to the circle and I see everybody else and she's reading off the questions and people stepping in further, and I look at my childhood and I'm like, a lot of these people in this yard are just like me.
There was one step I should have taken that I didn't take, and I saw some of my brothers and my friends take that step, and I felt like such a coward. I wasn't brave enough to be there with them when they took that step. And every round after that, I took the most difficult step.
Our traumas kept us separated. We were all on the circumference, all standing apart. But once we began to acknowledge our traumas publicly, it brought us all closer together.
In prison, you're not supposed to show your weaknesses in prison, though. But to want to do that, to walk in that circle like that, and to take each step forward was a reminder to ourselves that we still have a humanity and we worthy to be loved, though. Most people on the outside don't understand that we want to change so we can re-enter society better than what we left it.
And I think one of the things that when you was yelling that no shame and you had us yelling it out, it was freeing us too. And it was a point to where when I was looking at that and we was all looking at it in a circle, you can hear that echo, no shame. And that was very powerful, especially coming from a little lady like you.
I'm 76 years old. I've seen a lot. I don't like talking. I like to meet people that understand what's happening without words, and you one of them. Today has been one of the best days I had in my whole entire life since I've been locked up these 40 years.
Let's take a few moments to reflect, take a breath, think about what you feel having seen the video. Please put any responses you have into the chat if you'd like. Wait a few moments. We put up this saying by Victor Hugo. We really believe the work that Fritzi's doing with the Compassion Prison Project. She's now working with prisons around the country. Over 3 million, there's been over 3 million views of that video. We really encourage you to send it to people you know. We really think she's going to become nationally known for the work she's doing. And she has participated in a number of the workshops we've done. And recently we worked with 22 child advocate centers covering the whole state of Missouri in 114 counties. And Fritzi came twice to our presentations there and is just very giving and dedicated to her time. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is what's called the adverse community experiences. So in addition to adverse childhood experiences, there's what's known as, we call these ACEs too, adverse community experiences. They're poverty, exploitation, racism, discrimination, street violence, and generational trauma. And these are some of the conditions that so many children and adults are experiencing, in addition to one or more of the ACEs from the original study. There's also trauma associated with substandard schools, poor housing, lack of employment, and food insecurity, to mention a few. But think about how adverse community experiences put pressure on parents who struggle with food scarcity. These ACEs, adverse community experiences, have a massive impact on society. And then there's hurricanes and wildfires. They're also environmental traumas. Now, over the course of the ACE study, there were volumes of clinical records that provided statistics on numerous health issues. Keep in mind, participants were mostly white, middle class, college educated. 2/3 of them had at least one ACE and 90% had two or more. With an ACE score, as you can see, lung disease increased, cancer increased, depression, incarceration 7 times, suicide. It's extraordinary. The CDC that says that ACEs are the #1 health crisis in the country and the least known. Well, I guess that's what they said before the virus came around. But up until then, well, why were these the least known of the health crisis in the country? Because we don't want to talk about our shame. We don't want the stigma. So when teachers especially know about the ACE study and trauma responsive approaches, such as empathic listening and the nonviolent communication work, these can be lifesavers for the children. Now, nonviolent communication, NVC as we call it, and empathic listening, we'll be covering in a workshop that we will be doing at the end of August. I believe it's going to be on the 30th. So when we understand the neuroscience of ACEs, which we're going to look at shortly, this adds an even greater perspective and awareness that aids in understanding so-called adverse behavior. Right now, we are in the midst of a universal trauma, and the trauma responsive approach is as important for adults as it is for children. And we are researching the latest in trauma-informed care, and we attend conferences on a regular basis. Recently, we heard a story about a student who rode the school bus every day and had her hair in very elaborate braids. And one day when she was on the bus, she had no braids. And the bus driver asked her why. She said that her mother had died and that it was her mother who had braided her hair every morning. The next day, the bus driver brought some hair ties and asked if the student would like her to braid her hair. And the student said yes. Can you imagine how something like this could give a child some hope and create actually a lifelong memory? When any school or community member helps build resilience for a child, that's a victory. And it also suggests that ACEs are facts, not fate. A trauma-responsive approach works to transform how we relate and respond to others. Trauma-informed awareness is essential for any school and community service center. In schools, it must include all staff members, cafeteria workers, maintenance workers, bus drivers, etc. With our trauma-responsive curriculum, our long-term vision is to help alleviate trauma and improve the health and well-being of children and their communities nationwide. Details on our curriculum and guidebook are on our website. It's trf.net, which stands for the Relationship Foundation. All right, we're going to watch another video that focuses on neglect. So let's begin that video.
Everyone in a community has a vested interest in everyone else's children, because everyone else's children determine the next adult population that makes for a successful society. Built into our biology is the need to have responsive interactions with adults.
Neglect for children is when they don't get what the brain is expecting to get, what the child is expecting to get, what we are biologically prepared and waiting for, which is input from those around us.
It's this back and forth serve and return interaction that literally shapes the architecture of the brain.
Serve and return begins when a child looks at something or observes something, makes an utterance, and that represents the serve. And the return is when the parent notices the child doing these things and responds to the child.
Under conditions where serve and return is broken, you literally are pulling away what is the essential ingredient of the development of human brain architecture.
It was a really compelling series of experiments where they started by videotaping the mother and the baby engaging in cooing and smiling. And then they asked the mother to basically put on a blank face and not respond at all. When a baby is not attended to, that is a sign of danger to the baby biologically. So the stress systems become activated.
In a brain that is constantly bathed in stress hormones, not that's up and down, that comes with normal development, certain key synapses, the connections between nerves, fail to form, and critical regions of the brain.
So neglect both fails to provide the stimulation that's needed to develop the basic architecture, and when it's at a certain level, is one of the most potent activators of the stress biology of a young child. So you get a double whammy.
Science points to 4 categories of this spectrum of neglect. The first category would be what's called occasional inattention, where children experience responsiveness most of the time, but occasionally adults don't respond. There's no harm in that, and in fact, there's probably some benefit.
A child can learn to self-soothe and explore the environment, and all of those opportunities build brain architecture.
The second category, scientists would call chronic understimulation, is where on a regular basis, children have less interaction with the adults around them than is needed for healthy development.
Those children typically, when provided with enriched learning opportunities and more typical levels of serve and return, will show catch-up.
The third category is what science would call severe neglect in a family where not only are there prolonged periods of inattention and lack of responsiveness, but often also associated with not being fed enough, not being bathed enough, not having basic needs met.
Neglect is a huge problem in the U.S. Children are much more likely to be neglected than they are to experience any other kind of maltreatment.
We see the child really being at risk for much more substantial kinds of deficits down the road that don't necessarily get easily fixed or ameliorated. This is where we really need to think about more complicated and often more intensive strategies to help undo those effects.
The fourth category, called severe neglect, generally found in institutional settings, is the result of children living in kind of warehoused type situation in orphanages.
And it doesn't have to even be as extreme as orphanages. It can be experiences that are regretfully occurring in many, many parts of our country.
Often institutional care in this country is under the euphemistic name of transitional care or temporary care or assessment facilities.
If you think about what institutional or residential care would look like for an infant, where there's somebody new coming onto the shift every 8 hours, it really alters the development of the child's brain architecture and other aspects of the child's development.
We have the potential to change children's developmental trajectories.
Interventions can apply to parents, to foster parents or adoptive parents, child care settings, Head Start settings, and other kinds of settings. And really, what they're about is attuning people to the serve and return process.
Neglecting young children is neglecting the foundations of a healthy next generation. The community pays a huge price later in terms of the problems of the next generation, whether it be educational achievement, economic productivity, good citizenship, the ability to parent the next generation. All of the things that have to do with a healthy, prosperous society.
Let's go back to the other slide on the film. Okay, good, thanks. So what was the essential message of this video? Relationships shape the biology of our brains. Babies take in everything like a sponge, and neglect is trauma. So children desperately need a safe connection to adults, a nurturing connection. Our genetic nature is to be neurologically connected to others. So relational health is essential for every child. And the first years of life are an explosive proliferation of synaptic connections in the brain. It's where two neurons meet. This is called a synapse, and we'll go into that shortly. And in a low verbal household, by the age of 2, a child knows 100 words. This is relational poverty. In a high verbal household, by the age of 2, a child knows 500 words. So relational health makes a huge difference in brain development. At the beginning of the video, Dr. Shonkoff said, everybody is invested in everyone else's children because everyone else's children determine the next adult population that makes for a successful society. Now, in the next slide, this is an image of a child in a Romanian orphanage where there was tremendous neglect. And we learned about this from the video I mentioned earlier, a tribute to Dr. Vincent Felitti, who, as I mentioned, was the co-principal initiator of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. We're showing this picture because it reveals how traumatic neglect can be for a child. So what are your thoughts on the neglect video? Please put any comments you'd like to put into the chat. And we'll go to the next slide and wait a few moments for those of you who want to put something in the chat. Often, we don't know why people behave the way they do. It's because of events that happened to them when they were functioning at a very primal level of the feelings they experienced in their early years. In other words, they get into situations that bring up memories that have branded them from the past, and they emotionally return back to that 5-year-old child, even younger. Can you think of any children or an adult who acts way below their age? Well, as the brain gets more anxious and out of balance, hormones of stress called cortisol and adrenaline are released into the blood system and detrimentally affect the brain. So now when we say act your age, we know it's not possible for someone when they are chained to their emotional past. When a child faces danger like abuse, neglect, or turmoil at home, the subsequent stress often shows up as, we call it, troubling behavior at school and on the street. We don't call it disruptive because that can brand a child for all through their school years. And brains that are branded by trauma lead to lifelong difficulties. When children behave in limited ways, it's because it's all they know. This, unfortunately, is the issue with adults as well. They simply weren't supported in early life to learn about their needs and feelings and how to express them clearly. So with this information, which we'll discuss in our nonviolent communication on the 30th, adults are better able to understand the root cause of why some kids and adults are so unstable. We believe that in order to effectively address trauma, besides this work, the public needs to develop more science literacy, which we'll go into shortly. Well, as a child, what worked for me was getting in trouble because I was craving attention from adults, but it always backfired. Getting in trouble was at least being seen. The negative attention was all I got. For today's children, they have a new stressor. In March of 2020, the isolation began. As mentioned earlier, a year in a child's life is like a lifetime. They are an emergency remote, but responsive, trauma responsive informed awareness can help ease their nervous systems. And this healing can begin in their homes and especially in their schools. All right, on the next slide, this is my father, Benjamin, when he was 5 years old on the right side, and he's holding my aunt and my cousin, Henry. And I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where my dad grew up. He grew up on a farm. We did not live on the farm. His parents left the farm early when he was a teenager. But I found out this picture was in our hometown newspaper because there had been a fire in the barn and Uncle Henry did not get out. My father never told us about this. He died when I was 19. I'm guessing the shame that he felt and the blame and how he kept it all inside. And he didn't know how to feel safe enough to tell his family what had happened. And he wasn't conscious of the effect of past emotional branding. So many of us have in our history information that we haven't shared. And it's really, as you could see in the video with the prisoners, something really opens up when we do. But that was back in the 60s and the 70s. So things have changed quite a bit. Now, on the next slide, I'm smiling. I look happy. I grew up in what I would call not such a happy environment. I call it punishing silence. And I grew up thinking that I wasn't wanted. And it was as though I lived in Lonelyville. Did any of you grow up in punishing silence? What did teachers see in me? Was I a happy kid? What did my teachers and neighbors think? Well, on the other end of the spectrum, did any of you grow up in chaos and turmoil? Or did you grow up in micromanaging, hovering, and a controlling environment? Maybe you grew up in a stable and loving environment. We do hear about these sometimes. Well, would you put in the chat whether you grew up in the silence, the chaos, or the controlling, or if it was stable? We're always curious to know how people that come to our webinars, looking back, think about how was it in your home life? Silence, chaos, controlling, or even a stable, healthy, loving environment. I'm sure my parents were very well-meaning, but they were likely replicating the parenting they received. And at the turn of the 20th century, the life expectancy was 42. Today, we're living more than twice as long as the human species has ever lived. So our work around healthy relationships is more important than ever because now we are going to be with people for 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years. So not every kid in the classroom is smiling and doing okay. They might be struggling with things that are behind the smile. Children who are subjected to repeated adversities experience what's called toxic stress, and the consequences are dire. Secure attachment is either diminished or not present at all. They see the world as an unsafe place with no one there to help. They think they're insignificant, and they don't trust adults. They become hypervigilant and stay on a high state of alert. They feel isolated and have low self-esteem. They experience abandonment in all areas of their lives. In our workshops at schools and colleges, we emphasize nurturing lifelong friendships and how important they are. Now, in order to be trauma informed, it's important to know how vital nurturing is, as well as the science of brain development. Here's some basic information on brain science. When we go to sleep, we drop into alpha, then theta, then delta brainwave states. Delta is the deep sleep state. Well, the first 2 years of a baby's life, they are perpetually in the delta brainwave state, and they are essentially living in a dream world with their eyes open. Think about children, how they look around and stare up and stare down, and they look at you straight in your eyes. Make sure that you're someone that's safe to be around. Well, as a result, their attention is on their inner world of feelings. And when they begin to feel uncomfortable, they look through their senses to see who or what caused the feeling. That's why they are so deeply sensitive and deep feeling. At around 7 to 9, the beta brainwave state, the analytical mind, becomes activated. That's what the state we're in right now. Now, as a child begins to develop in this state, they become more self-aware, but it acts as a barrier to separate the conscious mind from the subconscious mind. However, early experiences remain encoded in the memory of the subconscious. Someone says, "What's wrong with you?" How do we react? Well, the memories of every time a judgment was made will often rush to the surface, and we react both from the present and the past. Now, to broaden our perspective, we're going to look at the neuroscience and how it affects us physically and mentally. This is the autonomic nervous system. We're going to show how some of the science provides insights into the effect of trauma on the brain. First, let's look at the basics, starting with the brain stem. It's on the left. It's in purple. It's the gateway to our spinal cord. On the right are the spine and all the connections from it to the brain up into the brain stem. The spinal cord is a component of the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic means involuntary and unconscious. The autonomic nervous system is comprised of our brain stem and the spinal cord, and together they regulate heartbeat, breathing, digestion, vision. This does not involve thinking. It's automatic. It's kind of like our bodies are on autopilot. So are you aware of your breathing now? Your digestion? Your heart rate? No, they are working automatically. So now we're going to give you some background on the parts of the brain to provide further insight into the effect of trauma, especially on the brains of children. The amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex are especially affected. Now, the limbic system is the area that communicates feelings to the brain stem and to the spinal cord. The hippocampus and the amygdala are part of a broad network of different brain functions in the limbic system. You see them in the diagram. First, let's discuss the hippocampus. It governs our memory. With chronic and repeated stress, the hippocampus, responsible for long and short-term memory, shrinks and becomes less effective in information retrieval. Well, here's an example. When I was in 3rd grade, my teacher had us all repeat, "What is 7 times 7?" 5 minutes later, she asked me, what is 7 times 7? I couldn't remember because of my trauma, because my hippocampus had shrunk. Do you know any kids like me? When there's trauma, the hippocampus shrinks. Next is the amygdala. It's known for the fight, flight, or freeze response. When there is stress and fear, adrenaline and cortisol, the hormones of stress, are released into the blood system and into the brain. And adrenaline and cortisol are neurotransmitters. That means they directly influence brain function. Repeated stress and trauma can result in a person becoming hypervigilant and constantly on alert. Trauma also affects the prefrontal cortex, which is critical to concentration, focus, learning, decision-making, planning, logic, and perspective taking. And science now shows that the response humans have to daily stress is similar to the stress response we had when we were running from a saber-toothed tiger. Except our daily stress is not life-threatening. Do you know people who act like their stress is life-threatening? Adrenaline is rooted in our survival instincts. So when a truck suddenly comes at us, adrenaline rushes and we get out of the way. For way too many children, the disruption in their lives is like dodging trucks all day. When an adult, especially teachers, reprimands a child, they often experience that as a kind of discomfort. And in a way, it's like dodging another truck. And research now shows that the punishment model not only doesn't work, but it's counterproductive. Not only does punishment affect memory, it affects the prefrontal cortex, which is critical to learning and processing information. And by the way, there are also hormones of pleasure and satisfaction: dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. Oxytocin in particular is associated with being in love. And an interesting point to note is that even when someone is falling in love, there's a nervous excitement and anxiety, which ironically is generated by the hippocampus. So in the next diagram, we're going to see a healthy brain compared to the one that's experienced trauma. Trauma is more emotion than the brain can handle, and it's not a one-time incident. And brains that are overloaded with stress hormones become toxic when they're activated over and over, and it inhibits normal brain development. So with trauma, you can see there are large areas where there is no biochemical activity. So the trauma affects the development of the brain. When there's trauma, the body is flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. ACEs cause this type of toxic stress. And toxic stress over time damages neural pathways. But brain architecture can be rewired when there is a safe and stable environment. And the more one feels safe and stable, the more healthy one's brain becomes, actually creating new neural pathways. And this is called neuroplasticity. So neurons that fire together wire together. And neuroplasticity also means we can unlearn negative behaviors to help us to respond to stress in a more measured way. Now, we're going to explain a bit about neurons. This is the brain science simplified. There are 86 billion neurons in our brains, and they're busy working away. And there is one neuron meeting another neuron. Neurons are constantly firing and wiring with each other. Neurons are brain cells that transmit electrical signals to each other. And during childhood, elevated levels of stress hormones can lead to diminished neuron production. In the next slide, we're going to see what's known as a synapse. A synapse is a gap between two neurons. This is where electrical signals travel from one neuron to another. It's known as firing. As we exercise our brain right now, this evening, new things and practicing the skills that we learn, we form new synaptic connections. This is known as wiring. In the next slide, we kind of get a look at what neurons look like that are firing and wiring. At somewhat what things look like inside our brains. There is electrical activity, and the synapses are going at a rate that is, it's almost like this, not the speed of light, but something very close. Now, as we close, we're going to share about something called epigenetics, and the effect on our brain architecture, especially on children. Now, epigenetics is the study of one's environment and how it affects gene expression. Well, in the center of every cell in our body is our DNA, and in each strand of our DNA lives every gene type. So imagine, every cell of your body has this DNA strand, and every gene type is in there. Every gene type is coded for a specific physical and mental characteristics. So we have genes for everything: hair, eyes, fingers, our organs, such as our heart and our lungs, and our brains. Now, this is called the gene tree. Our genes are responsible for our inherited traits: height, hair color, chin shape, weight, all the different bodily traits that we have. However, inheriting a gene doesn't mean that our genes will express the same characteristics as our parents. This new science of epigenetics reveals that there is a strong interrelationship between how our genes manifest and our physical and social environment. In schools, environmental factors are hallways, classrooms, the school bus, the cafeteria, and the playground. They all play some part and some role in determining how our genes will manifest. This is the same thing for our home lives and work situations. So behavior is affected by the gene expression in our neural pathways, and it's a direct result of the conditions that they are subjected to, both in and out of school, at home, and on the street. When there is trauma, it is like inflammation to the evolving brain architecture, especially in children. So if a child is struggling at home, ideally, we want them to feel like they are handed a life raft when they walk through the school doors. And that life raft is called safety and stability. And again, we'll go into that in detail on the 30th when we talk about this extraordinary life skill, nonviolent communication. So for most chronic conditions, genes only make up 10 to 20% of the risk. So many of us have heard some people say, well, my parents had this illness and I'll probably get it. Well, there's only up to a 20% chance you will get it, but it depends on your environment, and 80 to 90% are environmental factors. So if you have a gene in one of your cells that is coded for a certain disease, and there's a history of it in your family, there's actually less of a chance of it developing if one develops a healthy, low-stress lifestyle. This is called pruning. Neurons that are no longer in use can actually unwire. Just like pruning a bush, neurological pruning can clear the way for potential positive influences, just like you saw in the Step Inside the Circle video, and just how we're seeing in classrooms when kids feel safe and stable. This is Bruce Lee. We recently came upon this quote, which some martial arts students may appreciate, but it's really for everyone. He said, "Don't speak negatively about yourself, even as a joke. Your body doesn't know the difference. Words are energy and cast spells. That's why it's called spelling. Change the way you speak about yourself, and you can change your life. What you're not changing, you're also choosing." So this is a time to help children engage in life-affirming thoughts and the words that they say. Now, think about our attitudes and how our brains work. Let's take a child who their parents have to pull them out of bed to get them ready for school. They drag them downstairs. make them eat something, get them off in the bus. But on the day that child is going to a field trip, they're out of bed before their parents. They're eating, they are emotionally already on that field trip. So that's why we prioritize the work we're going to talk about on the 30th, the nonviolent communication. It's a way of expressing yourself so that you are actually almost in a way ahead of the event as things are developing in your life because you have a perspective. And that'll be on Tuesday, the 30th. So what we say in conclusion is children and adults don't have a behavior problem, they have a brain problem. And we put all of this together, we can see that troubled kids and adults don't have a behavior problem. And with basic knowledge of brain architecture, we can see why they have the problems they have that originate in their brains. So disruptive behavior, in the next slide, you'll see, we say kids and adults with ACEs respond to the world as a place of constant danger, and their disruptive behaviors are actually coping mechanisms. We say that their behavior is out of their control. This is a hard pill to swallow, especially for teachers. But as a trauma-informed approach sees children as their circumstances, not their behavior, the child begins to feel much safer in the school environment. And for many of us, this can be a hard pill to swallow. But by seeing children beyond their behaviors, even adults too, you can provide an opportunity to create a safe and harmonious environment. Resilience is the ability to function in a healthy way, even in the face of trauma. Just one caring, stable adult can affect a child's brain chemistry and its healthy development. So nothing is a substitute for relationship building. Now, there's a film called Paper Tigers where you can see that replacing the punishment model with care, communication, and compassion, well, in a 3-year period, suspension days went from 796 to 135. Graduation rates went up 5 times. What school doesn't want these results? And you can find Paper Tigers on one of the streaming websites. Again, one caring, stable adult. This is the key to a child's sense of security and safety. And think about someone in your life who is that caring, stable person, how they make a difference. Relationships drive brain development. That's it in a nutshell. The more you have healthy relationships, the more your brain will develop in a healthy way. And we say that change happens at the speed of trust. And if we're going to get through this period, there has to be a seismic shift in our focus on mental health. We hope you found this work interesting, and we hope you're inspired to utilize it at your centers, at your schools, in work, and in your communities. And just like the bus driver who was there for the little girl, we want to provide support for whole communities. Humans are a marvel of adaptability and change. In this work, there's the potential for kids and adults to break free from the chains of their emotional past, the trauma and the chaos. There is the potential for all of us to develop a genius mind. So we have our survey in the chat. Please use it to give us your feedback on the presentation. You can also request more information about our work. If you're from a school or an organization, please let us know. And if you've already answered the survey, we'll add you to our newsletter and mailing list, and you can unsubscribe if you don't wish to receive it anymore. So the survey should be in the chat. Now, this is a sampling of some of our monthly webinars, and we can see we had one of our biggest turnouts was ACEs in the prison system, where we showed Step Inside the Circle. And there's also another video on the Compassion Prison Project's website. and that is their site, Compassion Prison Project. It's called the Honor Yard. So if you got a lot out of Step Inside the Circle tonight, I think you'll really get a lot out of Step Inside the Honor or the Honor Yard, where you see a lot of the prisoners who were in the video talking about how they came to a place of understanding and strength, and they sound like community leaders. And I think, and we all think that what's going to come out of the work that Fritzy is doing with the Compassion Prison Project is going to have prisoners, instead of coming back and going back very shortly, wind up becoming community leaders and leaders in their neighborhood. Okay, so here you can see our school and organization workshops like you are receiving tonight. We can do the same presentation for everyone in your particular location. We do an extended version of it, and our curriculum and guidebook are also available to be ordered, both for individuals or for entire schools and organizations. And we cover quite a bit on the adverse childhood experiences and the neuroscience, and then we go into how to apply the nonviolent communication to bullying and self-esteem and boundaries, and really important subjects that are essential to develop a healthy and fulfilling life, both for kids and adults. So let's open the chat now for questions or comments. You can unmute if you have any questions. You can raise your hand, and Cicely's eyesight is much better than mine and can see that. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And if you go to our website and you want to make a donation, we're always grateful. It helps us to support the work that we do in our webinars every month.